So this panel is also hosted by the Diaz Collections and Call and Response Journal. And so I want to introduce myself first. I'll be moderating tonight's panel, and I am the founder and curator of the Diaz Collections. And the Diaz Collections is essentially a grassroots LLC that provides nurturing spaces for up-and-coming and long-standing Black and Brown artists. This LLC functions in Philadelphia, but it serves the entire African diaspora at large. So that's just a little bit about my brand. And so I also want the panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm kind of gonna go down the line and I'll call you out. And you can say your name. Oh, Jess. Oh my God, Jess. You are. Hi. Oh my gosh. You look beautiful. How are you? Good. I'm glad you're here. So I was just going down. I want to go down the line and let you guys introduce yourselves and also tell the audience what genre of writing that you find the most sanctuary in. So I'm going to start with Caesar. If you want to go first, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Caesar, and at this moment in time, most prominent area of writing is poetry and actually script writing. So I've been writing since I was 11. I started actually writing novels and novellas when I was a kid, and here I am now.
Yes, that's amazing. All right, we're going to turn it over to Veronica. And you can also tell us a little bit about Call and Response Journal if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm Veronica. I'm Veronica Elizabeth Thomas. I am the founder and lead editor of Call and Response Journal. Welcome everyone who's joining us. And we've partnered with the Diaz Collection to bring you these 3 panels. The first one will be for poets and writers. The second one will be for artists. And the third one will be for entrepreneurs. And a little bit about myself. I'm also a writer because I'm a little nervous. Because I'm a Black woman, I write from the perspective of a Black woman. So my writing is always informed in that way. I write short stories, poetry. I'm moving my way into screenwriting. So that's a little bit about me, and welcome everyone who's decided to join us in this activation.
Yes, I love that. Okay, Lynn, hi, how are you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lynn. I refer to myself as a storyteller. My writing that I think I find the most sanctuary in would be poetry or creative writing. And I say creative writing because I'm really trying to push myself to think of words as like concrete things and the way that they like live and breathe on the page, either in meaning or in structure and presentation. So I've been dabbling in a lot of like concrete poetry and visual poetry lately, but I've also done things like essay writing, interviews, reviews, script writing, and have been writing since like first grade. I've always wanted to be a writer, so yay. And I get to teach writing as well. I'm a teacher, so.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, Justice, can you tell us?
Hey loves, how y'all doing? So my name is Justice Hamilton. I am a professor and an essayist and a poet for myself. I haven't quite gotten there yet in terms of like sharing my poetry with others frequently. But one form of writing that's really been bringing me sanctuary right now is kind of writing autoethnographically. So doing a lot of journaling, tying that experience into kind of what I'm experiencing as a Black woman who is both a professor and a graduate student. And also like moving through a pandemic as we all are right now. So yeah, that's me. Oh, and sorry, and I'm an entrepreneur too.
Yes. Yes.
So my brand is Black August Designs. I do work with crystals, crystal healing work, as well as wire wrap jewelry.
And she's so amazing at it, by the way. Okay, so I really want to jump into the questions. I want to spend as much time in discussion as possible, but I do want to let listeners know that if you have any questions, please just drop them in the comment box, and I'm going to do my best to sort of moderate that. So I want to start with talking about how does being a Black poet or what does being a Black poet or writer mean to you, and to your art form. And I kind of want to ask everybody, so we can kind of go down the line as a beginning question, and I can start at the other end. So I can start with Justice if you want. And I can go the other way.
Yeah, no problem. You said, what does it mean for you to be a Black woman poet? Yes?
Yeah, what does it mean to you or to your art form?
I think for me, I've always seen myself as a creative thinker. And so I think that poetry is a part of like doing, living, breathing, how one kind of moves through the world. And I see that kind of being a part of really everything that I do. I feel like when I am, I guess like feeling, sorry, I'm relating this to this current moment, right? So I'm thinking about like when I'm feeling away in this pandemic, right? Poetry comes to my mind. Like Claude McKay's If We Must Die has been like playing in my head on repeat for the past like 2 weeks. And just thinking about how that even informs the way that I write. And so traditionally, when you think about academic writing, that writing is very linear and can be potentially very soulless. And so putting my soul, putting metaphor, putting poetry into those types of writings, for me is just it's just a part of who I am and part of how I have to show up.
Yeah, thank you. What do you think? What does being a Black poet or writer mean to your art form?
Am I next?
Yeah.
Is it me? Okay, I couldn't hear you. I was like, I don't know. So I think that it's impossible for me to separate being a Black woman from any like thing that I do. I would say that being woman and being Black are probably the two most significant like identity markers in my life, and therefore when I write and the way that I move through the world, it's like a compass almost, and a lens at which I view the world. So it's really hard to think about like what would it mean for me to separate that part of my identity from anything that I do. I also feel, I've been thinking about this a lot because this is National Poetry Month, and just thinking about the writers who have like raised me and where my poetry has come from. I think that poetry is so powerful because it's accessible to anyone, and for generations in Black culture and Black families, we've used prose and poetry to hold on to our histories, to like transfer them to young people. And so as I think about like being a storyteller, I also think that I like being a Black woman storyteller there's also this sense of like responsibility to something greater than myself.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Veronica, what do you think? Yeah.
Well, it's important as a Black woman. It's important. Poetry is important. Wait, can you reiterate the question? I want to make sure I get this right.
Essentially, like as a Black female writer or poet, what does that identifier, being a Black female writer or poet, how does that influence your craft or influence your art form?
Right. It's everything. I'm not sure if I would be a poet if I wasn't a Black woman, because my poetry is so informed by my experiences of being a Black woman. Just from, it can be anywhere between small microaggressions to large acts of racism, or it could be anything between like the curls on the top of my head to the color of my skin, how I'm feeling that day, how I'm projecting the feelings that other people put onto me, how I put onto other people as a Black woman. It's all together. There's no way I can separate my identity from my art or my identity from my craft. It's completely intertwined, and I wouldn't be in this position today, or I wouldn't be the person I am, who I am today, if I wasn't a Black woman. So there's like no way for me to separate the two, and it's so important to my work.
Yeah. I love how you said you don't know if you would be a poet if you don't know if you would be a poet if you weren't Black or female. I think that's really interesting. I think it also speaks a lot to what Justice was mentioning about like conveying soul in your work. And I'm interested in sort of how, what that process looks like. But before I touch on that, I want to allow Caesar to answer. I'm sorry.
Oh, please. Being a Black writer. Honestly, yeah, I'll go ahead and be the person to piggyback off of both Veronica and Justice. Like, the truth of the matter is, I don't really know if I would have anything to say if I wasn't a Black queer woman. I don't think I wouldn't have any messages from spirit if I wasn't a Black woman. There is such a, there's such a godliness. There is a God within being Black and within being a Black woman. You know, there is like an unexplainable struggle and an immense beauty that comes with us and with being who we are. And I wouldn't have anything to say if I were anything but Black, or anything but a Black woman specifically, because there is no woman out there who's going to be able to say like, oh yeah, I have a similar story as a Black woman. No, you don't. You don't know what it's like to be completely ostracized from the outside world and from within your own community. Black women fight every day to be understood by Black men. Black women fight every day to be understood by their own Black mothers. Black women fight this really kind of incredible and unfortunate battle every day, and somehow we always rise. Like Maya said, we always rise. And that's a fact. You know, my queerness plays heavily into this and into my style of writing. It's a really huge part of who I am too, because Black femme queer voices are most definitely shut down and most definitely ignored. And you can't read any of my writing without knowing that I'm queer, or knowing that Black queer women exist. And there's not one choice or the other. I'm not choosing whether to be Black or to be queer, because I am both of those things, just as I am Black and a woman. And that's its own story. That's its own thing. So, like Veronica said, this wouldn't exist without this responsibility. But Spirit chose me for this responsibility. Just like Spirit chose everybody on this panel for that responsibility. So here we are.
You spoke to, I think, the idea of spirituality, and Justice was talking a lot about soul and conveying soul in your work. And I'm interested in is it a spiritual practice for you guys, or what does it transcend for you? Or even, what does your practice entail? Do you have to be somewhere sacred to write? If so, what is that place for you? And I'm sort of interested in this idea of soul and spirituality in regards to how it transcends our writing, or influences our writing. So I think I'll ask about, what does your practice entail? Like, when you write, is it a practice for you? Is it a ritual? Do you have to be someplace sacred in order to do it? Or are you the vessel of what is sacred? Do you just have to be with you? Because if we're speaking about Black womanhood, that is something extremely sacred. So I think I'll ask about that, about your writing processes. So I'll ask Veronica first. I'm sorry, I'm like picking people out, but if you don't feel comfortable, I can pass it along. But I'll ask Veronica, what does your writing practice entail, or what does it look like for you?
I can definitely speak on writing being a ritual for me, it's mostly a spiritual experience. And that if I don't find the time, or if the time doesn't come to me to practice writing, or to to just write in general, I do feel imbalanced. So for example, after at the end of last year, I stopped writing and I felt very lost. I felt very unbalanced, unhealthy, but I that's like going way far. But I didn't feel like myself for the longest. I started writing again since being in quarantine. I don't want to say quarantine forced me to write, but quarantine definitely helped me to pick up the pen again. But writing is definitely a spiritual experience. It helps keep me balanced. It helps keep me focused. And it's also a purging of a sort. It's like journaling, but it's not, it's very similar, but it's not identical. But it's definitely a purging for me to release those emotions, those thoughts, put them down on paper. And for that simple act is a ritual to me. I don't have to be in a certain place physically, but mentally I have to be in that mental space to put, anything down. So yeah, that really speaks to me when you say that it's a ritual, because it is a ritual. But for me, it's not a physical one. It's just mental.
Right. What about you, Lynn?
I would say for me, writing is definitely a spiritual process, but my process varies all the time. So I think the way that I view writing, like one, I didn't actually share any of my poetry with anyone from the time I was in first grade when I started writing until I was 28 years old, and I'm 32 now. So there's this like large chunk of my life where literally my poetry was just purely for me. And I came to poetry as like a coping mechanism. I was going through some really serious like trauma in my household, physical and mental abuse, and having a hard time talking about it. My parents were very much of the mind like, what happens in this house stays in this house. So poetry was my release. It was one of the only sacred places that I had to like process all of those things that were happening. I think that as it comes to process, usually what happens is I am like out in the world and I see or observe something that strikes something deep in me, and then it like comes out. So I don't have set rituals around writing. I let the environment and what I'm going through, what I'm processing inform what comes out. But then as it relates to like revising, editing, I usually prefer to be by the water in nature, very present with the universe as I'm doing that kind of work. But the spirituality, like poetry is a spiritual process for me. It is an act of healing, transmutation, all that kind of stuff.
That's really interesting. I think it's really interesting what you talked about in regards to sharing it and exiting you, just your eyes. I think that's really profound. I struggled a lot. I think I personally struggled a lot with that. I went on this crazy journey, something that changed my life, and I self-published a book about it without ever thinking I would ever do that. And then I gave it to the world, and I was releasing it, right? Out into the universe, and I allowed people to read it, and it suddenly felt like there was something in me. Writing had always been simply a practice for me and my thoughts and me alone. And once I gave it to the world, it was like I couldn't write anymore. And exactly what Veronica was talking about, I didn't write for about almost 2 years. I couldn't figure out what to write. I didn't feel like I had anything else important to say. I felt like I bared my guts, and then I gave it to the world, and suddenly my trauma was then open for interpretation by other eyes that weren't mine. It's so interesting that you speak to that, and it's really interesting that, Veronica, you also spoke about that, but I want to ask, do you feel a responsibility to share? Do you feel a responsibility to share your work to the world or in general? And so I think I'll ask Caesar, what do you think about that? Do you feel a responsibility to share?
No, because the truth of the matter is that I really don't care what anyone has to say. This really isn't for anybody but me. Now, I think that You know, I think responsibility and maybe duty are not the same word, right? Like, so I really, like you were talking about rituals and responsibility. I don't have a ritual for writing because it's not like, it's not a thing that I felt like I had to put into practice. Because the truth of the matter is that writing was already so innate in my knitting, in my creative web. It's the hub of where all of my art came from. Writing is what led me to go to school for photography. Writing and reading are what led me to be a writer, to be a reader. But the truth of the matter is that words, period, held this really kind of large space in my head. And Lynn touches base on how she said she's a storyteller. I don't really actually go by the title poet or writer. I just go by the title wordsmith, somebody who can manipulate words and use them in basically any way that you want. To be completely honest with you, I could totally weaponize words in a way that nobody would ever want to see. And that alone is a gift directly from spirit. So I think, you know, when you ask me about responsibility, no, I have no responsibility to anybody but myself and spirit. Now, do I have a duty that I was handed? Yes, because I wasn't just given this gift just to have it. And like, spirit wasn't like, oh yeah, like you can just have this gift, you know, without being like, but here's the thing, you have to go heal with it. Or you do, here's a message from me, boom, go give it. So I have a duty, but I personally do not feel like, oh, this poem I wrote about this person, I need to go share this with everybody else. Like the poems that I write about lovers are for those lovers or are for me. You know, there's no responsibility there except for me and that person, for me and that woman, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I just, what I do feel responsible for is creating a safe space for Black women like us. That's what I feel responsible for. I choose to do that. I want to do that. So that now is a responsibility I've taken on.
Right. Right. So I think I'm also thinking about people that we have read or that come into my mind that have influenced my own personal writing, maybe in a direction for a phase of my life, or maybe in general, just my writing in general. But I often find that I personally can't write unless I'm reading. So I'm wondering about what each of you are reading and who has inspired your writing the most, or for it could be for a full length of time, your writing in general, or for a phase of time. And so I want to ask Justice, I'm interested in what you're reading and who has inspired your writing.
Oh God. Okay. I love how, like, as you began this, I was like, one, I know you're going to call me first. I was like, two, I was like, why is everybody's name hopping out of my head? But I will say that Audre Lorde is like my forever inspiration. May Ayim, who was an Afro-German poet back, and also a friend of Audre Lorde's. Louisa Tish, because I think that for me, the title of one of her most popular books is Jambalaya. For me, I've realized that like my writing is, as my spirituality and my spiritual practice has developed, my writing has illustrated itself differently. So like now it's just like phrases pop into my head and I'm like, oh, I have to write this phrase down. And it's like, I don't know where these thoughts are going, right? It's not like what am I going to write about? It's like a voice comes while I'm cooking and I'm like, fuck, okay, fine. I have to listen to the voice and like start writing down. So I think that in thinking about authors, okay. And then also I read a really beautiful book that I just cried the whole way through was Daughters of the Stone by, I forget Dalma's last name. I'll put it in the chat. And then also The Stars and the Blackness Between Them. If you want to read some beautiful queer young people YA love. It's insanely beautiful, but it makes me think about how our spiritual practices, especially like as we kind of are growing to delving more into traditional African American magical spiritual practices and also African traditional religions, how those things are showing up in people's writing, and how that's doing the work of resistance and also healing ourselves and our communities.
That's amazing. Thank you. Yeah. I kind of want to hear from everybody on what they're reading. I'm really interested. So I'll let Lynn go. If you're reading anything, if you're not, it's okay. But and your biggest influencers, if you want to name those two.
For sure. Audre Lorde is by far my biggest influencer. So when Justice said that, I was like, yes. I do a yearly reading of Power of the Erotic that just like every year I feel like helps ground me in my divine feminine power. So just so much great stuff. The thing about Audre Lorde that I think is so dynamic and people that I'm currently reading is Audre Lorde has found a way to harness voice in so many different forms. So not just in poetry, but in essay writing and short stories and novels, etc. And so I'm really drawn to storytellers who are able to do that. Alice Walker is another storyteller who pushes through different genres, James Baldwin. Currently I'm reading Henry Dumas, which if you have not heard of him, he is a phenomenal writer, poet who was an activist who wrote about police brutality and was eventually killed by the police in the 1960s. But his work was almost like fading into oblivion until Toni Morrison came across it and some of his mentees. And so since ushering him into publishing, there's just so many more resources. So I can't say enough. Henry Dumas, folks should definitely read him. I will also say that, so right now I'm in a place where I'm putting together a zine, a chapbook, and a poetry collection, which is crazy to do all of those things at the same time. I don't know why I'm doing it, but that's what I'm doing. And when I get into the space where I'm like putting a collection together, I step away from reading entirely. And part of the reason why I do that is because there's so many inputs that are coming in, and I want to make sure that I'm able to hone in on my voice and not like emulating other people's styles. So I'm actually in a period right now where I'm really just focused on my own poetry and my own poetry reading and presentation. So
Thank you for sharing that. Veronica, what are you reading?
So Toni Morrison is always in rotation. She is my biggest inspiration, my biggest influence. And I will say that Toni Morrison sees the parts of us, like the Black community, she sees the parts in us that we don't even want to see. So her work is very brave to me. Her work is very bold. It's honest. And that's what I'm constantly striving for. That's the goal I'm constantly striving for. She's been a huge inspiration. But throughout the quarantine, I have been reading, I'm gonna grab it right now. I've been reading Leaf and Bone, which is not by any one author, but it's a collection of African praise poems. And it's really been influencing my recent work with the way that these poems utilize repetition, and the way they utilize blunt imagery, like the words and the way they describe, the way these communities describe what they see. It's very blunt and straight to the point. And I find that so refreshing. So I'm constantly flipping through and reading these poems in a way that I hope I'm not like imitating, but I'm definitely influenced by, and I can't wait to really dive deep and have a day where I'm completely inspired and I can see what comes of this influence. So yeah.
Thank you. Susan, what are you reading?
You know, I'm reading a few things, but I'm reading Anais Nin again. She actually is not Black. She is a European essayist, but Delta of Venus is really one of my favorite books. And the whole point of it is kind of a corroboration of intertwined short stories that deal with taboo in sex. And I read this book when I was super young at first, and now touching base on it again as an adult who has engaged in quite moving sexual intercourse. It's interesting to kind of almost place yourself in these really outlandish scenarios in which I can kind of transmute. If you read any of my writing, I honestly really like the idea of trying to almost rework and normalize the conversation around sex and around lesbian sex too, in a very sweet and romantic way, and less of a less of an ignored way. It just seems like for some reason sex is this huge kind of like taboo conversation that no one ever really wants to talk about, even though everyone participates. And even lesser so, Black lesbian sex or Black queer sex is discussed in kind of any space, because that is also a really just kind of like strange and taboo thing to a lot of audiences. So that's kind of what I'm reading right now. But honestly, I don't actually really gain any influence from novels. I actually gain most of my influence from lyrics. So I listen to an insane amount of music. Um, and if you are a really great lyricist, then and you have a story to tell, that's kind of where I pull direct inspiration from. So really kind of smaller artists, people like Tirza, she's really great, half Black, British storyteller. And we all know James Blake. He always really has something to say. Moses Sumney, Solange, Ampa the Great. She is a really awesome African kind of healer and singer, and they always just have something really interesting and beautiful and romantic to say, and those are kind of where I pull my direct inspirations from.
I really love that everyone's putting all these books in the comment box. Please keep doing that. I love that. But I do want to ask this one question. An audience member is wondering, is there a period of your life you write about more than others? I think that's a great question. And I will start with Veronica.
That's actually a difficult question for me to answer, because with the way my craft works, I actually take parts of my childhood or parts of who I am now and insert them into a character that's in a different place, a different space, a different time for mine. So none of my work so far it's never been me. It's never been completely me. So it's always been like little bits of my character or my attributes entwined in this character, but the character's never in my space. It's never like I don't know this character at all, but they're me, but they're not me. There's no clear way to explain it, but yeah, I don't have one particular part in my life that I constantly write about. It's a constant ping pong ball of back and forth between different times of my life and different characters.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. Wow. Okay, Lynn, what about you?
Yeah, I would also say this is a difficult question to answer. I think that I would say that I am a retrospective writer. And what I mean by that is it's really hard for me to write about things as I'm like actively going through them, particularly if they're like super traumatic. So while I might be able to write about smaller incidents that have happened, a lot of my writing comes from reflecting on situations. And so like as an adult, I'm still processing like some of those events that have happened in my childhood. I'm processing, like my dad was an alcoholic who's now sober, and like we're rebuilding a relationship. So there's a lot of things that are coming up now that have been there, but I just couldn't write about them before. So I think that I'm always reflecting on relationships. I'm married, and my husband, it drives him crazy because I'm constantly writing poems about other lovers that I have had in the past and those breakups and stuff like that. And I'm gonna do it anyway because that's just what inspires me. But yeah, I sort of have this degree of separation with time, I guess, that I experience in my writing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, but I was thinking, I've been thinking a lot about me personally, about how since COVID, my writing, I feel like I'm falling gently back into, I think, a ritual for myself, which like I said, I took a really long time off from writing or feeling compelled or like I had anything really important to say. I don't know. And so I feel like I'm gently falling back into it. And it's also allowed me to definitely explore other genres that I never thought I could work in, or I never knew that I could like write an article or a blog post. I've always sort of existed in poetry for some reason. It's always been something that fed my soul the most. But I'm wondering, for all of you guys, if since COVID, has your writing changed? Has your writing style changed? Has the way that you approach writing changed? Or what it means to you? Because I think we're in a very interesting time right now, where I almost feel like all I really have to, like all I can do is write. So like, I'm really interested to hear for you guys is how that's affected your style or your form, or even your view on writing at all. So I think I'll start with Justice. She's like, no.
Yeah, I feel like this is the one time what I gotta say is limited. I've been writing more, which has been great. I think this has been a great time for slowing down. And so I think, yeah, my writing has increased. Yeah, I had something for the last one, but this one I'm like, yeah, no.
Well, tell me what your intro was for the last one. Sorry, I didn't call on you. You should have said you should have let me know.
No, it's all good. Dory is so sweet. Well, tell me. So I think that and as I said that, I was like, I don't even remember what the last question was. It's all,
Hold on. Let me think, because now I'm like, my mind is in a million places.
That's how I feel.
Last question. It wasn't. Was it about?
Oh, it was about. Nope.
Is there a period of your life that you write about more than others? Was it that one?
Got it. Yes. So definitely there's I find that wherever, I'm very present in my desires, particularly as a researcher. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, for example, several years ago when I was moving through an eating disorder, my research was around Black women and eating disorders. When I went into graduate school, it was around Black women in graduate school and self-care, which is funny because I currently am still having to write about this because it's my dissertation topic. But now I'm finding myself more interested in hoodoo. And so that's where my research is. And that's where my writing and my thinking is and being is kind of living. And so I find that it's always kind of coming from a hunger to understand, and then to be able to articulate that in a way that people can feel and connect to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask Lynn, I'm interested in if this experience, this COVID experience, has changed anything for you in regards to writing, or increased the amount that you are writing as well.
I have not been able to write about quarantine, isolation, COVID, and actually I think initially it was very frustrating for me because going back to this idea of responsibility, I was feeling some responsibility to, I don't even know, I think sometimes, especially with social media now, like we're able to see so much of our peers' work. And a lot of like people have been inspiring me in their writing. But I think in the last like 2 weeks, I've really resolved myself to like, right now, I am not going to be able to write about this. What I am able to do is be present. And often when I experience things that are triggering or that feel traumatizing, which being in isolation in this way at times feels like that, again, I'm just not able to process that in the moment. And I think as an adult, I have resolved myself to that being absolutely fine, and that's where I am, and that's probably why I'm working on 3 different projects, because I still have a need to be creative. And so I think my writing is living in editing, it's living in revising, it's living in thinking about moving things to concreteness. But I'm not really writing right now, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Veronica, what about you? How has this time affected your writing?
I'd say the first week and a half, I still was like in the space where I wasn't writing during quarantine, like the first week and a half. But then after the first week, I started working on myself and started meditating, and I started taking care of my hair again. I have natural hair, and of course, like before I fell into my funk last year, I was taking care of my hair, but when you're not really in that headspace to care for yourself, little things like your hair is not going to be a priority. So once I started to fall in love with my body again, started really looking in the mirror, taking the time to have time with myself, because now I had the time with myself, that's when I started writing. But my writing had nothing to do with being in isolation, because I didn't feel like I was in isolation, like mentally. Physically, yeah, I'm stuck in the house. I have to wear face mask and gloves when I walk out the house, but that's when I walk out the house. When I'm in the house, I don't feel trapped. I feel very much at home. I'm at home, but I feel more at home now than I had any time before. I don't want to say complete, because I'm always a work in progress, but I definitely feel more towards content, and I feel so much more settled now with this quarantine going on, because I have the time to really do a lot of introspection. So yeah, I've been writing, but it hasn't been about isolation.
Okay. I also want to know I'm going to start with Caesar, but I'm interested in, do you want to answer that question also, by the way? I'm so sorry.
Do you, whatever feels right.
But I'm really interested in how people are like feeding inspiration, or how finding inspiration. I think it's very odd, but I feel like I have more inspiration now than I did before COVID, in regards to writing or just creative energy in general. Do you feel inspired right now? And if so, what are you inspired by? Or how are you feeding that?
That's kind of a difficult question, actually. I don't know if I necessarily feel inspired. I feel. I'm learning that. Amazingly enough, as a poet, I actually have always had a really hard time allowing emotion. And as a writer, I always wrote from outside experience. So if you read maybe some of my writing or poetry now comparatively to a year ago, it would actually be incredibly different, as I've gone through different experiences over the last year. So over the last year, I fell in love for the first time. And what I realized is that completely changed the way that I wrote about love, because what I realized is that I was writing about love from a guessing point of view. I was assuming what it was, or maybe picking up pieces of what it was from David Levithan and other poets, or classic novels and timepieces, right? This really like romanticized version of love that actually does not at all have anything to do with Black lesbian love at all. It did not resonate in even the slightest parts. So, that my experience, my inspiration comes from, I guess, experiences. And there's really no I don't know, there's no really one thing that just inspires me or whatever. It's very, it really is truly based off of maybe even a muse. People are really against kind of the idea of muses, which personally I think is fucking silly. Look, dude, if I get a good poem after some good pussy, writing it. If I get a good poem out of going out to eat, I'm writing about going out to eat, guys, and it's gonna be beautiful, and you're gonna love it. So I don't know. I think it's very real time, which ties back into your last question. Is there a specific time that I write about? No, I write in real time, in current time. So my poetry now is not about the same person from last year or from a few months ago. It is about someone new and someone extremely different. And so, inspiration is always changing and evolving.
All right, Lynn, your turn, girl. What you think about it?
Inspiration. I think along the lines of what we started by talking about just how we were doing, and my emotions have been ebbing and flowing so much, and so some days I'm very emotional. I am an empath. I'm also an ambivert, so I get a lot of solace from recharging by myself and also from being around people. But right now the input is a lot of being by myself and not being around people. So I think that the inspiration for creativity has therefore ebbed and flowed, which is probably why I haven't been writing as much as I've been able to put things together. I am fine. I am not searching for inspiration, but what has been inspiring to me is just being able, now I have the time to connect with other artists. I have time to follow through on projects that I had no time to follow through on before. Coming to things like these where I get to talk to other Black female creatives has definitely helped to, I don't even know if inspiration is the word, but maybe keep me grounded in my art is a better sense of it. But I think also not holding myself to being inspired by anything and just being again present in what's going on and what's happening right now and taking it day by day.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask this one other question that an audience member just put down, which I think is interesting, is how do you select names for your characters? So I'll start with Veronica for that one.
That is a great question,
yeah.
Because now that I'm looking through, especially in my short stories, most of my characters don't have names, most of the protagonists. And I'm not sure if that goes back to me seeing myself in them or me putting myself in them, so they remain nameless. But I find that with my stories, they're moving towards something else. They're moving out of something else. They're moving out of the situation. They're moving out of a mindset. So I don't find it necessary for them to have a name because names are transformative to me. And names should represent where you're moving towards or who you are at that moment. So I definitely work a lot with the idea around colorism. So most of my characters, most of my characters, if they would have any name, they would have a white name, like Sarah or something, and they're moving out of that mindset. They're moving out of this internalized racism. They're discovering their beauty. They're discovering their worth. So they don't really have names because their name doesn't matter. That's who they were. And my stories are more about who they're becoming or who they are now. So that's a great question. I never even I never dissected why or even thought about why my characters don't have names, but I try to think of a name of one of my characters and I couldn't, of one of my main characters. So yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that answer too.
No problem.
Okay, Justice, what about you? How do you select the names for your characters? What people you write about?
So I don't really. This is another one where I'm like, nope,
No,
not me at all.
no.
Sorry.
All right. I want to, but I do want to ask you. I have one other question. I have about 5 more minutes left, but I do have one other question about what does the editing process look like? I'm interested in that. What do your guys' editing processes look like? Like, I know when I wrote my self-published book, the book I self-published, I didn't edit anything. And I felt like it was the most liberating thing I've ever done. I literally just copied and pasted my entries from my journal into a Google Doc, and I was like, this is the book. And I felt as if there was something profoundly vulnerable in that, in not going back and correcting thoughts and grammatically fixing anything. I was just like, this is just me spilling my guts. And I haven't done that since, but I do remember that feeling of feeling extremely liberated by that, of not editing anything. So I'm interested in what does your editing process look like, or how long does it generally take? Is there ever a time where you don't edit? So yeah, I start with you, Justice, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. It took me so many years to get to the point of editing. And being comfortable in editing. And I think a lot of that was, I think there's certain ways in which I'm a perfectionist, but I'm not like a type A person, really. I think I am in my mind, but I don't think people receive me as that, as such. But I remember I had this professor once who told me that basically a lot of the beauty lives in editing, right? And so that it's like you don't have to immediately be perfect. And for me, I think as a secret inner perfectionist, that was very freeing, because it's like sometimes you have ideas and they're extremely rough, right? Or they're grammatically incorrect, or they're very piecemeal. And so I think for me to be able to now think about that, and I try to keep that playing actively in my mind, to kind of calm my inner perfectionist, so that way things can actually come out of me to then be edited. So I don't necessarily know how long my editing process takes, but now I realize that it is more of a communal process. So I have folks that I get together with, and I'm like, here, please read this thing. It's okay. You can be straightforward with me. And I find that's really, really helpful for me to get out of my head if I need to.
Thank you. Okay, Lynn, tell me about your editing process. What does that feel like for you?
I'm about to nerd out for a second. So I think so. I have been reflecting a lot on the difference between revising and editing, because I think that there is a difference, and oftentimes people use them interchangeably. And for the students I teach, it's really important for them to sort of understand the difference, and that has informed the way that I think about my own revising and editing. So revising is when we take a look at what we've written, and we make sure that the ideas are fully fleshed out, they're fully realized, they say what we want them to say. It's really an intimate process between us and whatever form it is that we're looking at. For me, it's on the page. Whereas with editing, it's thinking about the experience and how people are going to experience the piece, whether that is in a spoken form or on the page, again, for me. And before, I would say that I felt, so my first book, I didn't do a lot of editing. And one of the reasons why is because I was looking back on work I had created when I was 20, 21, 22, and I was in such a different space in my life, and I didn't want to compromise the voice of that young person who had written those pieces. But with this second book, I am being very, very thoughtful about editing, because again, I'm thinking more artistically about where do I want people's eyes to go? Where do I want reprieve to come as they move from like one sentence to the other? And that's informing where I place things on the page. And so I have some poems that are like sideways, or that one line is here and the other one doesn't come until the bottom of the page or the next page. And it speaks more to like the experience that the reader is having. And it takes more time, but it's honestly like, it's a lot of fun to be thinking in that way. And also to like force my friends to, not force them, well, yeah, I force them to read my stuff, not necessarily for feedback, but just to be present in the way that they're experiencing what I put together. That's been really fun.
I love that. Thank you for that. Okay, Veronica, lay it on me. What does the editing process look like for you?
That's a tough question. It's another tough question. When it comes to poetry, my poetry is not, for me, in my opinion, or my intention with my poetry, it's not made to be recited out loud. It's made to be, internally, it's made to be digested by the individual who's reading it. So when I do edit my poetry, or not even, I'm going to use the word edit loosely, because even my editing is very loose. It's not like something, oh, I have to put the comma here because poetry rules tell me that to put a comma at the end of the stanza. Like, it's never been that way. It's more been about, how does this sound in my head? How does it sound coming off my lips, but as a whisper? It's not meant to be like, I feel like I would kind of be exposing myself to like anyone in the room if I were to say it out loud, even if no one's in the room. It's something that's very personal and internal. So my editing is very quaint, I want to say. It's very minimal, because in your head, you're not thinking about periods and exclamation points. You're not thinking about punctuation or just any type of type form or anything like that. It's just all in your mind, and that's how I intend for my poetry to be engaged with. That's how I intend for it to be read. So editing is very minimal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Okay, Caesar, tell me.
Oh, baby, I do not edit. Everything is written everything is written exactly as it is supposed to be read. That's how I write. I don't, like, as I write it, if it is supposed to look crazy, or if it's supposed to be spelled incorrectly, or if it's supposed to be maybe dramatized, it is written that way. Like, I don't decide to go back later and be like, you know what? Something about this, I need to put a semicolon right here, because there's a long, deep breath being taken between, this phrase and this one. Really, it's more like, okay, this is how I'm reading this. This is how I'm being given this. So this is how it's going to be written. Whether that's 6 commas and no and, or 2 commas and no period, like, there's the editing process very similar to Veronica. Like, typically my poetry is not for spoken word. I am not a spoken word artist at all. My poetry is meant to be completely internalized, and also the point of my poetry and the point of my writing is actually to be taken into 100 perspectives. So however the person perceives that poem, however they read it, is how it was supposed to be read for them. That's how it is for them.
Right.
It's not linear. It's not secular. It's not a box. It doesn't exist for one type of person or whatever. Like, however you read this, however the cadence was in your mind, if this poem was actually a rap for you, if this poem was actually a song for you, if you sang it, if you totally and completely changed the wordage, right, and had 2 words per line, and that's how you read it, that was how it's supposed to be read for you. So no editing is really done. I write every poem as I think that they're supposed to be written. That's it.
Listen, y'all, I am really stunned by how phenomenal this panel was. Like, thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing your words and your experiences with me and with everybody listening. And I kind of want to just do a little quick wrap up, but I really want to actually like applaud, like, thank you for coming and being here and showing up and sharing. But I want to say that thank you, obviously, to the panelists who participated, and thank you for everybody who listened. And I want to give the opportunity, if you felt inspired or if you felt called by anything said in this discussion, you can send your writings to my email. I'm going to put it really quickly in the comment box so that people can send their writings if they would like. Sorry, I don't see that. And I also want to remind people that if you brought a friend tonight and you and your friend both came, you're eligible for your little goodie basket from Dirty Lemons. Please send me your email and with your name and the name of your friend that you brought tonight. And I want to encourage all the panelists to drop their social media handles into the comment box so people can follow you and keep up with your work and just love up on you. I love that. And at the same time, I want to say the Call and Response Journal is currently accepting submissions for their second volume. So you can find all of the submission information on their website. And if Veronica wants to say anything else about that, but yes. And I think that's about it.